All right, by my clock, we are at 11:05. So I'm going to get things going here. Well, welcome everybody, and thank you for joining us today at our webinar. This is the sixth installment of the Muir Project's webinar series, Understanding the Science. And it's a webinar series that we started that does a deep dive into the newest, most relevant science on topics such as wildfire, ecology, biology, and a bunch more. And we do this to try to get this information to the public in a universally digestible manner. And so we try to have this be an interactive webinar and discussion that everyone can participate in and kind of have a baseline understanding when they leave. Today's webinar is going to be split up into multiple parts. Each presenter is going to be discussing a different topic, and then we will have a full panel Q&A at the end of our presentation. We ask that you submit all of your questions into the Q&A function. It's the discussion board that you'll see because we don't have an active chat. You may use the Q&A function as a chat as well. I will be monitoring that throughout the webinar, and I will be cataloging our questions and posing them and getting them ready to have the presenters ready for the Q&A at the end. I want to just flag that today's webinar is going to be recorded, and it will be distributed with our follow-up materials. Also, any questions that we don't get to into the live part of the Q&A, we will save and respond to in a written format, and that will be distributed as part of the follow-up materials. It's one of the perks for being a registrant for today's webinar. Like I said, for some of you who were on when I announced this, but just again, for those who just joined us, before we begin, at the start of the webinar, you should have received 4 polling questions. One is pertaining to your scientific background and experience. The second is about your personal interactions with wildfires. And the third and fourth are for our record keeping about how you found out about our Understanding the Science series. Like I said before, all of your answers are going to be kept private. This is for internal record keeping only. We're interested in this information so that we can better tailor our discussions and be respectful for people's experiences and potential past traumas. With that being said, in today's webinar, if anyone is feeling uncomfortable or is having a reaction by any of the discussions, please feel free to put that into the Q&A, and I will try to accommodate your requests and move the conversation along. With all of that technical and admin stuff out of the way, please join me in welcoming today's panelists on this episode of How the Forest Service Has Falsified the Scientific Record on Wildfire. I am joined today with 2 of the authors of this study, Dr. Chad Hanson, the Director and Principal Forest and Fire Ecologist of the Muir Project, and also Dr. Dominick DellaSala, the Chief Scientist at Wild Heritage and the former president of the Society for Conservation Biology, the North America section. This webinar is going to highlight findings from their new study called Countering Omitted Evidence of Variable Historical Forests and Fire Regime in Western USA Dry Forests, the Low-Severity-Fire Model Rejected. This was published in Fire publication in, I want to say, early April. And so it's really new. It's great. It's great information. We're really excited about giving this presentation for you today because this study specifically challenges commonly held assumptions about low severity fires and the resilience of dry forest ecosystems. So with that, our speakers are going to be offering a new analysis that debunks misinformation and exposes some of the truth about what's happening in our forests. They're also going to explain how this is impacting not only our forests, but subsequent forest policy. So forest and climate policy, which is very important. So thank you so much for being here today, Dr. Hanson and Dr. DellaSala. We're so excited to have you with us. And with that, if you wouldn't mind taking it away and help us understand the science, I can pass it to you, Chad.
Thank you so much, MC. Really appreciate it. Thanks everyone for turning out today to talk with us about this issue. I'm Dr. Chad Hanson, Forest and Fire Ecologist with the Muir Project. I'll be leading things off today, then I'll hand it over to my colleague, Dr. DellaSala. So I'm going to share my screen here. And you all can just let me know, give me a thumbs up if it's coming through okay. All right, good deal. Well, I'm going to be talking about some of our basic findings in our study, Baker et al. 2023. And the basic question is this. This is what we addressed. Is the long-standing assumption true that historical forests, ponderosa pine and mixed conifer in particular, that they were mostly open and park-like, and were dominated by very frequent low severity fire, surface fire, and therefore didn't have very many or any dense forests or moderate or high intensity fire patches. And that narrative, that notion of open park-like forests, very low density forests maintained by very, very frequently almost homogeneous low severity fire, that's come to be known as the Low-Severity-Fire Model. And it's contrasted by the mixed severity fire model, and I'll be talking about that. I talk a lot more about this in a deeper dive in my book, Smokescreen: Debunking Wildfire Myths to Save Our Forests and Our Climate. So if folks are interested in a deeper dive, you can certainly get a lot more information in Smokescreen, which I wrote for a general public audience, by the way. All right, so start things off here. There was a trio of studies published by a few dozen U.S. Forest Service funded scientists in 2021. One of those three in particular presented a number of studies that had been published by independent scientists like myself, like Dr. DellaSala, among many others, that had presented objective evidence about many, many dense forests historically in mixed conifer and ponderosa pine forest types, evidence of moderate and high severity fire, including large high severity fire patches. And so we had published these studies, and they noted those initial studies we published, and then noted a number of response articles that the Forest Service had published criticizing our initial articles. Now, they left it there. They didn't mention the large number of reply articles that we had made to their responses. And so therefore, it created a false narrative. The narrative that was created was that their response articles were the last word, and that therefore, all the evidence in our initial articles should be therefore disregarded and ignored. We published Baker et al. 2023 this past spring in order to highlight and catalog comprehensively the enormous pattern of scientific omissions that allowed them to do this, and specifically the complete and utter omission of this entire stack of reply articles, these scientific studies by independent scientists, myself, Dr. DellaSala, and many others, that strongly and soundly refuted and discredited the Forest Service's response articles. We concluded that the pattern of omissions led to a falsification of the scientific record by this group of Forest Service scientists. So I'm going to do a sort of deeper dive here into one key example. This is just one of many examples of this pattern of scientific omissions and falsification of the scientific record. There were two studies published by scientists funded by the Forest Service years ago, Collins et al. 2011 and Stevens et al. 2015. And these pertained to historical forest density and fire severity in Sierra Nevada mixed conifer and ponderosa pine forests. And they were based on century-old U.S. Forest Service forest survey data gathered in 1910 and 1911. Now, what they said in these studies, based upon these Forest Service surveys from a century ago, is that historically these forests only had about 20 to 25 trees per acre and only about 5% high severity fire. And when I read the first of these studies, I reached out to the authors and I asked them for their data because I know these were publicly available, U.S. government data, and they refused. And so I got curious. I went to the National Archives in San Bruno, California, and went through the training to handle their original records, and spent many, many, many days across months and even years researching these historical data sets. And what I found was pretty shocking. We discovered that they omitted most of the data. And certainly there were open and park-like forests historically. There's no question that that was a portion of the forest. And this is one of the photos from 1917 in the Sierra Nevada that the Collins et al. And Stevens et al. Authors presented in their studies. And certainly, here is an open and park-like ponderosa pine dominated forest. And here's another one that they presented. And certainly you can find photos like this. This was a part of the forest. The question is, were the forests homogeneously like this? Were they even mostly like this historically? And that's really the question. Did they really have, on average, only 20 or 25 trees per acre? Well, what we found is in Baker et al. 2023 is that Hagman et al. Omitted these key reply articles. And on this subject in particular, they omitted Hanson and Odian 2016b and Baker et al. 2018 that had enormous bodies of evidence in them that contradicted the response articles. So what we found, the evidence that was omitted by the Forest Service in Hagman et al. 2021, we found that Collins et al. 2011 failed to mention that they excluded 94% of the historical plot data. And that 94% on balance contained much denser forests. And so they had a skewed subsampling of the historical forest. That was problem number one. They also excluded, both Stevens et al. 2015 and Collins et al. 2011, excluded abundant evidence on small tree density and also high severity fire records. They also excluded oaks. But the evidence of small trees is really striking because, and we noted this in our reply articles, is that these historical data sets, they were written on cards by pencil. The surveyors back in 1911 wrote their records about tree density with regard to the larger trees. On the back of the same cards, they wrote the density about the small trees. And so it's hard to imagine how you could handle these cards and not turn them over once in a while and see that there is enormous wealth of data about small tree density. So the reason that matters is that in these studies, Collins et al. And Stevens et al., they basically assumed that there was little or no understory because ostensibly low severity fire was occurring so frequently that there wouldn't have been really an understory. That turns out to be completely incorrect. The last thing that they omitted, one of the other things they omitted was the correction factors, and I'll explain what that means in a minute. But the bottom line is the Forest Service realized a century ago that this methodology they were using to determine forest density was incredibly biased on the low end. In other words, they were dramatically underestimating the density of the forest, and I'll explain that in a minute. And those correction factors were established a century ago, and Collins et al. And Stevens et al. Did not use the correction factors. So that bias, underreporting the forest density, continued over into their studies. What we find when we actually use all of the data, including photographic evidence, including the field plot data recorded by these Forest Service surveyors a century ago, when we use the correction factors, when we use the small tree data, and also the abundant data on high severity fire occurrence, specific locations, maps, you name it. When we use all of that, we find a very, very different picture emerges. These are pictures of historical forests as well, about a century ago in mixed conifer and ponderosa pine forests of the Sierra Nevada region. And you'll see that, of course, there were open and park-like forests, but there were also very, very dense forests with very dense understories. Another example, there are many, many, many of these examples. There's an enormous wealth of these photographs. And what you'll find when you look at all the data is that you had obviously a range of variability. Yes, open forests with low density existed. They were a minority of the forests in these forest types historically. Most of the forests had moderate to very high densities, and the fire severity was highly variable too. Lots of low severity fire, sure, but not exclusively by any means. There was also lots of moderate and high severity fire. Here's just one example, and there's enormous bodies of US government historical photos from approximately a century ago that document the variable conditions, and including many large high severity fire patches. This one was some thousands of acres in size, and that did happen occasionally. A lot of the high severity fire patches were small, just as they are now, but some of them were very, very large historically. And one of the bodies of evidence that was omitted were these records where the Forest Service surveyors a century ago actually wrote the specific 40-acre section of each 1 square mile map section and actually documented for each one of those 40-acre sections whether there was mature forest and merchantable trees, which they wanted to log, or whether high severity fire had killed all the merchantable trees. And these are just quotes from two among the many, many records of these surveys that documented that in many of these cases, across entire 40-acre sections, across multiple, many different 40-acre sections, across entire map sections, their high severity fire in a number of cases had killed all of the trees. And so we know high severity fire was a key component. We brought this to light in our reply articles, but of course, when the Forest Service published the Hagman et al. 2021 article, none of this was acknowledged. It was as if this entire body of evidence didn't exist from the reader's standpoint. And that again created a falsification of the scientific record. The other thing, of course, they omitted was the correction factors, the fact that the Forest Service itself acknowledged a century ago that they were dramatically underestimating the forest. And the reason is simple. They had transects that they ran that were 33 feet wide on either side. And they were trying to visually estimate the distance of the transects and then visually estimate the number of trees of each size within that distance. So a 66 foot wide distance. The problem is they weren't measuring it with measuring tape, and they were just assuming and estimating. And it turns out that most of these they were looking at a distance that was much narrower than 66 feet total. And in many cases, the forest was so dense they couldn't see farther than 10 or 15 feet on either side of them. And so they were just recording what they could see. And so it led to a huge underestimate of forest density. And so the Forest Service came up with correction factors to account for that. Basically, they needed to double or more than double the tree density to accommodate for this error. But the Stevens et al. And Collins et al. Papers did not include those correction factors. And the Hagman et al. 2021 paper did not mention our reply articles that noted this. Among the other evidence that would have come to light if Hagman et al. had included all the evidence was the fact that there was extensive mapping efforts done by the early U.S. Geological Survey that mapped huge high severity fire patches in the 1800s. These white crosshatched areas are large high severity fire patches. They didn't map the small ones, less than 80 acres, but they mapped everything over 80 acres. And again, this was part of the occurrence. This was over the course of an entire century. Of course, so many of these areas burned at high severity in the early 1800s, and some burned at high severity in the later 1800s. Once all the data were accumulated and included in our reply articles, the picture that emerged was dramatically different than the one the Forest Service presented to the public through this series of omissions and falsification of the scientific record. What we found is that historically, on average, these forests had over 200 trees per acre, over 200, not 20 to 25 trees per acre. There was 22 to 39% high severity fire, not 5%. There were dense understories, including an average of 34% shrub cover, even in mature forest, and then, of course, much higher shrub cover in areas where most of the trees have been killed. Some areas had over 900 trees per acre. Now, that wasn't an average, but it was certainly part of the mix, just as a part of the mix was low-density forests that were open and park-like that comprised a minority of the forest. And the scale of the omissions of scientific evidence is breathtaking. It's simply breathtaking. This is a quote from Baker et al. 2018. This is one of the reply articles that Hagman et al. 2021 omitted and did not mention. And a quote, the evidence included 20 modern validations with plot data, 47 specific historical cross-validations in small areas, 6 large areas with general cross-validations, 99 corroborating observations from scientific studies, and general corroboration from 7 paleo reconstructions. So this is a massive body of evidence, stacks and stacks of science, different researchers, different methodologies, all coming to the same conclusion that the low severity model is rejected. And in fact, the mixed severity model is correct. Historically, these forests were dominated by low and moderate severity fire, but they had significant high severity fire, and they also had open and park-like forests, but they were dominated by moderate and high density forests. And part of the problem, and I'll turn this over to Dr. DellaSala after this slide, but part of the problem is the misunderstanding about the frequency of historical fire. The problem with fire return interval, which is now a discredited metric in terms of how frequently fire occurred. We know now we need to use fire rotation interval, which is a measure of how frequently, on average, fire actually occurred on any given acre. And it turns out it was more like 25 to 49 years in one study in these forest types, and it was 39 years on average from Baker 2017. So I will stop there and turn it over to Dr. DellaSala.
Yeah, thanks, Chad, and welcome everyone. Thank you for attending our webinar today. Before I get started with the slideshow, I just wanted to point out a couple of really important factors involved in this. In fact, if you get a moment and you want to read up on this, I put the two of the studies in the chat so folks can see the Baker et al. Piece and also the one that we worked on prior to Baker et al. That exposed a lot of this before we went forward with the claims of falsification of the scientific record. And as a scientist myself, that I've been working in this field now for 4 decades, when you get called out on falsification, that's a pretty serious issue for scientists. It was not easy getting this publication through. It went through extensive peer review. I think if I'm not mistaken, Chad, we have 5 reviewers on the paper. It went back and forth for a considerable amount of time, because when you call out researchers the way we did in a published set of articles, it's a very serious claim that's being made. And so you've got to really know what you're talking about to get it through peer review. And so, you know, this paper, I think, is over 50 pages with extensive documentation of where the record was falsified. And I just wanted to kind of share with you what falsification means before I jump into the slide presentation. Well, in the scientific community, it involves the manipulation of research findings or data to submit or to support a conclusion. And you know, there are 3 types of falsification issues that come up when issues like this happen. Plagiarism, which is a big no-no in the scientific community, fabrication, when you make stuff up, and falsification, which is when you manipulate research or you omit findings to support a certain cause. And so this is the claim that's being made. And it's not just an academic issue here. We're talking about a lot of the foundational studies that were in the series of articles that came out in Ecological Applications, I think it was in 2021, that are bolstering the Forest Service and the BLM's claims that these forests are overly dense, they need to be logged, otherwise they're all going to burn up in severe fires. And it was that series of articles that presented many of these studies that are now the foundation for what we're seeing in big timber sales before fire and after fire, post-fire logging. This is the foundation. I mean, we went right after the heart of the issue in terms of how it's affecting the way forests are managed over millions of acres and billions of dollars now being spent in the infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Law. And even though our findings are specific mostly to the Western United States, you know, I see that there are folks on our attendee list that are from Canada. And we're hearing the same things now coming out of Canada, not only in British Columbia, but with the fires burning in Ontario and Quebec now, it's the same kind of narrative that unless we get in there and log the forest, it's all going to burn up. And look at all the evidence that supports it. We even had certain scientists quoted in the media saying that this is unequivocal evidence that the forests need to be thinned. There's no longer an argument in the scientific community. And when we were looking at that, we said, oh yeah, we're not so sure that this is unequivocal. And so you can think of the paper that we published and the one prior about the Sisyphus article as it's equivocal. We don't have agreement in the scientific community. And there's been a lot of tweaking of issues that we suspect has been going on because there's a lot of money that follows this research, especially with the billions now being pumped into the two laws that I mentioned that are funneling unprecedented amounts of money into agency coffers to do more of the same, which is the basis behind the Sisyphus article that's in your chat. Okay, so I think where this is also is also winding up in the issues that you're all working on is in thinning being championed as resiliency management or restoration. And, you know, there are some legitimate reasons for thinning under certain conditions, but by and large, a lot of what we're seeing around the fire issue is just misplaced. And so now I'm going to share my screen so that I could show you what we've put together in terms of the presentation, my part of the presentation. So you should be able to see my screen now. Let me just get into the slide presentation mode.
Can't see your screen yet.
Oh,
Yeah.
that's no?
Not just yet.
Okay, not sure what's going on then.
Give it a try one more time.
Can you see it now?
Not yet.
No.
All right. Well, Chad, do you have the slides on your end? And I could just say next.
I do. Yeah, I can do that. Just
Oh.
a second. Oh, here
Oh,
it
there
is.
it is.
It showed up.
It's up. I guess there was a little bit of a delay.
Perfect.
You know, gremlins in the system. What can I say? All right. So, as I mentioned in my preamble, what you're hearing from Chad and I today has enormous implications in the way that ecosystems are being mismanaged across mostly the Western United States, spilling over now and has been for a while into Canada and other parts of the planet that have fire issues. What we do know is that missing in a lot of this discussion is the link to the climate signal and why wildfire activity has been increasing at least to the 1980s. And in addition to the climate signal, forests have really been strapped by the amount of logging that has occurred in them, ramping up mostly right after World War II, in some regions even sooner than that. But every US region currently is storing less carbon than it's capable of, and which is why so many of us are working on the mature and old growth forest rulemaking right now, is to give these forests the opportunity to grow back and restock their carbon supplies that have been decimated by logging, not by fire, but by logging. And yet fire is one that gets blamed all the time. So we have an untapped climate mitigation potential in forests through proforestation, for instance. Just let the forest mature and become old growth over time. And that's part of the climate mitigation approach that a lot of us are calling for. But what's gotten in the way of a lot of this is the misinformation, falsification of the record that we exposed in Baker et al. And there is lack of agreement in the scientific community, and also even with some NGOs. I mean, we're dealing with this to a large extent in Southwest Oregon, and I've seen it in the Santa Fe watershed in New Mexico, where the narrative is playing out to the extent of other science, such that the forests were mostly open, low density. Now they're all out of whack and need massive thinning. I mean, we're talking about a large removal of basal area from these forests based on a collection of studies that omitted much of the scientific record. And, this is one that Chad's very familiar with, a study by North et al. That's a falsified the record about tree densities, historic versus current, that were way off. And yet they recommended massive amounts of basal area reductions in the Sierra Nevada forest, allegedly to reduce fire severity. We're questioning not only the forest density information, but whether or not that would even make a dent in fire severity, because a lot of these fires, especially the ones with a high severity component, are driven mostly by climatic factors and much less so by the amount of vegetation that's in the forest. It really comes down to extreme fire weather that we're seeing increasingly because of the climate signal. So what we did in a number of our studies was, this one in particular is, and I testified in one of Westerman's hearings a number of years ago when he was claiming, and he's supposed to be like an academic, he's got a PhD, and he was out there, banging on the gavel about how environmental regulations in his hearing were responsible for the big fires because they couldn't get in there and do active management. And so Chad, myself, and Kurt Bradley started saying, hey, maybe we should test this as a hypothesis. And we did. We collected the largest data set ever on wildfire severity and looked at a number of variables, including land use, overlaid that 4 decades of records over 11 Western states. And what we found was the reverse, that the fires that were burning most severely were mostly on lands that have been heavily logged. Not to demonize high severity fire, because there's ecological importance of it, but if your concern is you've got too much of it, forest protection is not the problem. And what we were seeing in areas that were protected, like wilderness, parks, roadless areas, they were burning more in a mixed severity complex the way nature designed them. And they were burning more extremely in the logged landscape. And yet you've got, decision makers using this misinformation and backing their claims on some of the studies that were challenging. What we do know, in addition to the fire and the climate signal, is that these mature and old forests are incredibly carbon rich. And we just published a series of papers leading up to the current rulemaking documenting this for the whole country. The first ever mature and old growth forest inventory. It's got carbon information in it, biodiversity, water values for all mature and old growth forests. If you haven't seen that yet, shoot me an email, I'll send it to you. And other studies have identified that once fires do occur eventually in these forests, they burn predominantly at low and moderate severity, specifically in the Pacific Northwest, where researchers have identified the spotted owl forest as potential climate refugia, at least in part because those forests are burning under low and moderate severity, and because their temperatures that have been measured in those forests are lower than the surrounding logged landscapes. So these are the places we ought to be protecting, whether they burn or not, as climate sanctuaries. And then logging conducted as thinning removes most of that forest carbon. Very little of it is stored long-term in any of the products. So you're transferring most of that carbon directly to the atmosphere over time. Some of it goes right away. You'll see that in a couple of slides. And some of it's stored in wood products temporarily, but eventually it winds up in the atmosphere. And the emissions to the atmosphere are much greater when you thin and log over large landscapes compared to if a fire burned over those same landscapes. And even though you hear the claim all the time, we're targeting the small trees and thinning, they're really not. They throw in the large trees to pencil out the sale. They wind up killing more trees in the thinning operations than the fire would over a large area. And Chad has documented this in some of his studies, but they seldom, if ever, include the mortality from thinning the forest when they estimate mortality when the fire has gone through that thinned area. And so it's another form of misinformation. And we know that thinning is not some sort of benign activity. We can talk about that in the Q&A, but it has collateral ecosystem damages. That's in the Sisyphus paper that I put in the chat as well. And here's the Sisyphus. No, this is not the Sisyphus paper. This is the Mark Harmon study where we went out in the field. It was led by OSU researcher Mark Harmon, and we measured the amount of carbon in the high severity burn patches in the rim fire of 2013. And in the largest high severity burn patches, most of the carbon was still in the big trees. Very little of it volatilized, even though you hear these claims all the time that these large fires are causing all these emissions. It's actually logging that's the bigger problem. So it's just something to keep in mind when you're dealing with that in terms of what's causing more emissions, the logging or the fires. It turns out logging across the United States is causing a lot more emissions than all of the natural disturbances emissions that have been quantified. So that's just one human activity is stacking up more emissions than all natural disturbances combined, including fire. And this is some work that the Wilderness Society did years back that's still applicable. It shows the transfer of carbon to the atmosphere, how little remains in the trees that are logged over time. I mean, you start out with that live tree with all its carbon, and then you got logging residue that emits through decomposition quickly, almost half of the carbon that was in that tree. You got the bowl, you send it over to a milling operation, so you lose more carbon. By the time you go through transportation and you wind up in a wood product, most of that carbon is in the atmosphere. Very little is retained in wood products, and most of those wood products are short-lived, particularly in relation to an old tree. So it's just not carbon neutral or carbon positive, as you may have been hearing from industry and certain folks. So I'm going to wrap up here with, this is a really serious claim that we have made against certain researchers that are affiliated with Forest Service or Forest Service funding that is driving a lot of the logging projects and policies across the Western United States and actually worsening the climate crisis because of the carbon put in the atmosphere greatly exceeds that which would have occurred if you had a wildfire. We do know these big, large fires now are being driven mostly by extreme fire weather, and they turn more explosive when they hit industrially logged landscapes. So it's those two factors that are behind the big fires of today. It's extreme fire weather and extreme logging, and thinning is not helping. And anything that's tied to this before, after, and during wildfires, as noted in our Sisyphus paper, is making the situation far worse in a climate crisis. And this is why we really have been publishing these articles, is to call attention to this, because there are some really not only serious omissions of the scientific record, but it is having a major impact on how forests are being mismanaged everywhere from, the Pacific Northwest to the Southwestern United States and beyond. And that's where I'll stop.
Awesome. Thank you so much, both Chad and Dominic. That was really, really helpful. I am going to switch us over to gallery real quick. So we're all here and we can dive right into our Q&A if everybody's ready. We've got some really, really good questions already coming in. I'm going to start with this one. It's how to refute forest management arguments as to the cause of more intense forest fires. I believe Bill is looking for you to expand on that.
Do you want to take a first crack at that one, Dominic, or shall I?
Go ahead, Chad. I'll chime in later.
All right. So, I mean, it's a great question, because science has to matter, especially these days. The magnitude of the crises we're facing with the climate crisis and the biodiversity crisis, it necessitates that we get this right, and that policymakers understand, that environmental NGOs understand the science. And so I think what it means is that we all of us, and including Dr. DellaSala and all, we all have to get active in not just understanding the science, but then communicating it to the broader public. And there's lots of ways that can be done. Letters to the editor, to local and regional or national papers, organizing letter writing groups, opinion editorial articles are key. Obviously, direct communication with policymakers and their staff, whether it's the state level or the federal level. And also, of course, social media. I think people really need to get involved in disseminating this information and calling out the misinformation in every way they publicly can.
Yeah, I agree with Chad. The only thing I will add to what he just said is that, this is probably the most difficult thing that I've worked on in my 30 plus years, because the fire issue affects so many variables. I mean, when I work in rainforest, I pretty much have to solve for one variable. It's the economics of logging, old growth, and primary forest. It's not simple, but it's one variable that I'm trying to solve for. When I'm working in dry forest, there's smoke, there's fear of fire, there's loss of life, there's loss of property, and there's all this misinformation swirling around with legislators that are under pressure to do something, to do anything, because even the optics of doing something is worth more than doing nothing in their eyes. And so that's pretty much what we're up against. And the best we can do is to correct the scientific record, get it in the hands of the activists, and figure out a way to make this more palatable from a communication standpoint, and winning some lawsuits, which is also a challenge because of the deference standard on the part of the judges, the way they view the agencies. And we've got to keep pushing as much as we can, because everything that we care about in forest relates back to this fear of fire and the foundation of misinformation that has resulted in efforts to block wilderness designations, national monuments, strict protection of mature and old growth forest, you name it. Everything we are working on in forest is affected by this. So we at least have to get the science right and then get it in the hands of all of you, so that we can do the education and outreach that's necessary to start turning this thing around. We're making some progress. At least there's acknowledgement now for mixed severity fire. That wasn't the case 10, 15 years ago when we started out on this, but we still have a long ways to go because of how entrenched this has become in law, in policy. It's almost like it's become a religion. And so we're kind of looked at as the heretics, saying, wait a minute, you don't have the evidence here, you think you do, and you're doing more harm than you are good. And so we need to shine some light on this.
What really well said, and I'll just add one brief thing to especially the comment about the communications, messaging, and strategy. One of the key implications, I think, of the Baker et al. 2023 study and the correction of the record, and the calling out of the falsification of the scientific record, a key implication is that we should move away from our current policies that are focused on backcountry forest management and logging, those policies that are pulling so much carbon out of the forest and putting so much into the atmosphere, that are damaging important wildlife habitat and pulling a lot of mature and old growth trees out of the forest, and are not stopping fires. Oftentimes the fires are burning more rapidly, more intensely through those areas toward towns. So instead of what we're doing, move away from that, redirect those billions of dollars we're spending on doing the wrong things, and instead direct it into protecting communities from wildfires and jobs programs to help homeowners harden their homes, to do defensible space pruning around the homes to protect them, to create evacuation routes and bolster evacuation routes, all those things that we know save homes and lives. I think that's a key implication, is it really does support that shift in our focus in terms of where our funding and where the management is going.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you both for answering that question. We got a bunch more, so I'm trying to keep our questions a little bit organized in terms of flow based off our conversation. So I'm going to jump around a little bit. But someone asked, can you discuss any potential implications or applications of your research beyond Western USA dry forests? Are there any broader lessons or insights that can be relevant to other regions and ecosystems facing similar challenges in fire management?
Yeah, let me jump in on that one. A couple of things. First of all, thank you for that question. I also work in British Columbia. I see Michelle Connolly's on. Thanks, Michelle, for being here. Maybe you asked that question. And also, we've got a study currently going on right smack in the middle of the fires in Ontario and Quebec. And what we are seeing in those places that is exportable from our studies in the Western United States are some of the same things. It's really the climate signal that's driving the increase in wildfire activity. When you combine that to heavily logged landscapes, now you've got the powder keg. And Ontario and Quebec has some of the most atrocious logging I've seen since I've been in Malaysia. The rate of logging is stunning in those areas. There's no caribou habitat left. They've completely logged the landscape where if you get on Google Earth and look at this, it's stunning how much and how fast it's gone. And fire's burning right through it right now. So the people in New York and Washington, D.C. that are dealing with smoke, I hope this is a wake-up call. At least the administration and the Democrats are saying, yeah, we got to do something about climate change. But what they're missing is that combination. And we're still hearing calls for more logging from some members of Congress that are pointing to, well, we got too much fuel. I mean, they're extrapolating the Western misinformation paradigm to other regions. So it's not just Ontario and Quebec, it's British Columbia. The dry regions of the inland rainforest in the wet belt, for instance, where Michelle works, they've seen some increased wildfire activity. We've seen increasing fires in British Columbia in the drier places, and some of the same calls. We need to log because we've got too much biomass. And yet logging combined with extreme fire weather like heat domes that we're seeing at an unprecedented level now in those regions is what's really driving fire behavior. But, you know, we got the perpetuation of the fire mythology, which is really kind of tied to almost a religious belief that we've got to log to get out of the fire issues that we're in now.
Yeah, and I'll just add to that briefly. You know, even other parts of the world where you're not even dealing with conifer forests, you know, the eucalypt forests in southeastern Australia, we're seeing this same narrative weaponized there to promote logging, even as the science is telling us from that region that the logged forests tend to burn more intensely. The fires are more severe in those logged forests. The fires spread faster. And of course, logging is doing the same thing in terms of exacerbating the climate crisis by pulling huge amounts of carbon out of the forest and putting it into the atmosphere. So this seems to be something that's actually a global issue. And we focus, of course, on the Western United States dry conifer forests here in our Baker et al. 2023 paper. But I think the ramifications and the ripple effects are much, much bigger.
Awesome, thank you. All right, we've got a couple more questions here. This one I think will answer a few people's questions. I'm tying a couple together, but in your opinion, what are the key takeaways from your study that land managers, policymakers, stakeholders, and the public should consider when making decisions related to forest management and fire risk mitigation in Western forests?
I'll take a quick crack at that one just briefly. I think that the main implication, in my view, is that so long as fire is operating within the natural range of variability, as long as we don't have too much or too little in our forests, then we shouldn't be worrying specifically about fire in the forest. We should be worrying about the true devastation that's happening, which is the carbon being pulled out of our forests and put into the atmosphere that's making the climate crisis worse, and communities being directly impacted, homes lost, lives lost from wildfires. And those are two things we have control over. We can reform logging policies. We can reform our consumption patterns. We can protect a whole lot more forest for the greater good and to mitigate the climate crisis, and take those billions of dollars of logging subsidies and redirect them into saving homes and lives in communities from wildfires.
I'll just support what Chad just said by 2 quick points. First, we've got to get to coexistence with wildfire because there's no way we can log our way out of this situation. And, just to add personal experience, I lost half of my town where I live to the Omitted fire in 2020 because millions of dollars were being spent in the backcountry on thinning while the town burned down a couple of years later, and yet all the money's in the backcountry. And so the coexistence issue needs to happen with home hardening, defensible space, evacuation centers, smoke shelters, that sort of stuff. That's where the money needs to be spent. The second point is we have got to address the root causality here. There's a lot of really cool stuff coming out of the climate change literature now that is focused on attribute specific studies so that we can now tie specific extreme events to a climate signal and to the main sectors involved in putting out those emissions. And some of the studies coming out now are finding that signal with climate is intensifying and wildfire activity is the response. And it's coming from the major polluters, the coal, the oil, the gas industry. As long as we stay on our addiction to fossil fuels, this is only going to get worse. And it's not just wildfires, it's the whole gamut of impacts that are going to affect us increasingly and future generations because of the fossil fuel burning largely, and also the emissions associated with land uses like logging. So if we don't address those root causes, it really is like Sisyphus pushing a bigger and bigger boulder up a steeper and steeper hill.
Absolutely. Yeah. All right here. So I'm going to again summarize, but we had a couple questions about trying to rectify this information of other management strategies that people have heard. So examples of native lands being better kept than state and federal. And so the general question seems to be, if logging is not the answer, then what is? Are we using controlled burns or that? So to try to wrap up these couple ideas from a few questions that have populated, I summarized it into this question. Can you discuss the implications of your research for our understanding of fire behavior and severity, and how these findings might influence our approach to fire management strategy, including prescribed burn and wildfire suppression efforts?
Yeah, I'll just jump in there real quickly. It's a good question. It's an important question. We could do a whole webinar just on that question, I think. I'll just say this briefly. So, we haven't had a chance in this webinar, because it's not what we're focusing on here, to really talk about the ecology of post-fire habitat. But it's really, really important to understand that because the natural fire regime in these forests is mixed severity, and that's been the case for literally millions of years, tens of millions of years, that entire groups of plants and animals have evolved to depend on different severities. Some like the surface fires that creep along and burn at low intensity. Some like it hot, and they like those crown fire patches that kill most or all the trees, and they need that. It creates the habitat they need to survive. And so I say this just to create a little bit of context for my second point, which is that there is a broad consensus in the scientific community, and even the Forest Service scientists admit this, that we have less fire in our forests in this country than we did historically before fire suppression. Now, we're getting closer to natural levels in recent years and decades, and climate change is a factor there, but we still remain in a deficit. And so it's not a bad thing if we have more fire in our forests, including more mixed severity fire. We need more fire of all types. We need more managed wildfire, also called wildland fire use, letting more lightning strikes burn safely in more remote forest areas, so we can get more mixed severity fire for habitat benefits. We need to remove the longstanding administrative barriers that have been preventing tribes from doing cultural burning, as they've been doing for thousands of years. That's unfair, and it's a problem. And so I think that we need more of both. I think there's also a role for prescribed fire in certain locations. One example is an additional narrow buffer around communities as a fire safety measure after home hardening and defensible space have been done. So I would just say, the focus should be on fire, not on tree removal. And the conflation of those two things is a big part of the problem in terms of, the management approach. You don't need to remove any trees before you reintroduce fire.
And I'll quick hop in and say, if you're looking for more information on that specifically, there's a couple episodes in our webinar series, Understanding the Science, that are linked on our YouTube page, booked underneath Understanding the Science. It's a playlist of now, it's going to be 6 videos. So I'll point to those and I'll include them in our follow-up materials, as well as someone was alluding to that it would be really, really helpful in terms of communicating with those stakeholders, politicians, legislators, other community members and stuff like that. And even folks in the, different wings of the environmental movement, both in climate and forestry, how do we boil this down and distill it into talking points? And so that's also going to be included in our follow-up materials. We'll have like a 1-pager and some talking guidance to help circulate, and that will be made available to all our registrants. So I just wanted to flag that those resources will be available. I have a really cool hard-hitting question, and so I'm going to pose it to our speakers, but I will also give them the caveat that if they feel better suited to answer it more in writing with some more time, we can always put that too there. But I think you guys are both going to be able to like this one. So in Eastern Oregon, the Forest Service often relies heavily on recent Johnson et al. Studies to justify logging, particularly in mixed conifer forests. My understanding is that many of these studies use fire scar analysis to drive a low severity fire narrative of forests. Do you have any other guidance as to how to refute these Johnson et al. Studies in particular? Since they are locally based, the Forest Service and collaboratives are able to use that narrative to publicly discount larger scale studies. So, overarching question, are any thoughts in particular about how to refute those Johnson et al. Studies?
Yeah. These are questions about the Johnston et al. A few different studies by Johnston et al. Dr. DellaSala, you want to take the first crack at that one?
Yeah, and I think I know who said that. Thank you, Paul, if it was you. But anyway, the problem with his work is that it's undersampling, at least one of the problems, and he undersamples and then extrapolates over a large area based on his very non-random sampling design, which is a problem to begin with statistically. And fire scar sampling is notorious for underreporting high severity occurrence. The trees die, they decay, and you don't have a scar. So it's really problematic. And James has been one of the leaders in taking away the so-called East Side screens that were in place for over 2 decades, providing at least some protections for large trees. As you know, there have been a number of groups trying to get that back. There's been a number of publications that point to the importance of all large trees of all species because of their carbon accumulation rates goes up at the time when they're about 20 inches diameter and above, which is the point at which they were being protected, but are no longer being protected. The other part of the problem with his study is that it's based on, again, misinformation, that there is a big problem with white fir, or grand fir encroachment rather, that has come in from fire suppression and is choking off the ponderosa pine. And so now those firs are big because of fire suppression. They are starting to replace the loss of large trees from logging. So this is the structure we have in those forests now. In a recent study by David Mildrexler and Bev Law and Associates, they actually tested whether or not there was too much competition between firs and pines. And they used, I think, 1,600 FIA plots to look at the overlap between firs and pines and found very little overlap. So it pretty much shoots down the whole reason for taking out the large firs because of competition when you really don't have much overlap between firs and pines to begin with. There are major holes in his study, and yet this is what's being used to tear down forest protections that have been in place for 2 decades. And it's really problematic. And every time we push back, we get pushed back on. So we've got to keep exposing this misinformation. And, as you know, it may take legal action, which, there's already legal action in play to get this restored, and certainly having a strong rulemaking for all the nation's large trees and mature and old growth forests would help. The last point I'll make on this is that I've organized a scientist sign-on letter that has, I think, about 150 signatures on it now. Some of the nation's and the world's top scientists are on this letter. And what we say in the letter is that we need to protect the nation's large trees, mature and old growth forests. No exemptions. That is, if it's large, it's got carbon. If it's mature, it's got biodiversity. It should be protected. So no exemptions for whether it's a dry forest, whether it might burn, whether it might get eaten by insects. And being honest, we have taken a stronger stance on this than many in the environmental community. And we've got the backing of about 150 scientists to really push through a strong rulemaking without exemption.
Yeah, all well stated. I'll just add one brief thing, that you concern me in addition to the points that Dr. DellaSala raised. Some of these studies that profess to reconstruct historical forest density basically go to current old growth stands that have not been logged, and then look at the tree density of the trees, the size of each tree, and then they figure out, well, the age of those trees, and they sort of backcast and say, okay, well, if this tree is 180 years old and this one here is 220 years old, how many trees per acre were there 150 years ago, or et cetera. And the problem with that, it's probably obvious to a lot of people, but the problem with that is that you don't account for the live trees that were in existence 150 years ago or 200 years ago that then died from age or fire or drought and native bark beetles, and then fell over and decayed into soil, and then were maybe returned to soil by the fire that came through. And there's no evidence that those trees ever existed 150 or 200 years later. So the methodology is fundamentally flawed and biased from the outset, and dramatically understates historical forest density for that reason.
Alrighty, thank you guys. I have another pretty good question here. So some folks are interested in some talking points or statistics for how we can meet our demand for wood products, and also some more about alternative to wood products while leaving these forests alone. We've heard it's possible, and people are interested in how we explore that. That's another one where I'll give the caveat to the presenters if they have more information on follow-up that might be better suited. But
yeah, no, a good question. I think, I have material on this in my book Smokescreen. I've addressed this in a number of different chapters. I wrote it for a general public audience, but I have primary sources cited, hundreds of them in the endnotes. I'll just say this briefly. Our consumption patterns that are so heavily geared towards wood products, not just lumber, but also burning trees for energy, which is about the dumbest thing we could do, honestly, in the face of the climate crisis. It's even worse than coal for equal energy produced, about 40% so. Whether it's that or paper, the heavy focus on wood products is really being driven by policymakers putting their thumb on the scale with billions and billions of dollars of taxpayer subsidies at every level of government, but especially federal in this country. And those subsidies take many different forms. Some of them are direct, some of them are tax breaks and incentives and other things. Those subsidies need to be ended because there's lots of different alternatives for wood products. First of all, we can simply consume less. I mean, we don't have to use nearly as much as we do. We really don't. and we can pare down how much we consume. But second of all, there are lots of alternatives, lots of great alternatives for paper. You don't have to cut a tree down to make paper. Lots of good alternatives for building materials. One that I think is exciting, that I think has got a promise, is hempcrete, which is now structural. It's slightly carbon negative, amazingly. It's actually cheaper than wood, especially if once the subsidies are taken into account. It doesn't have economies of scale yet, but in large part, the reason for that is that it's competing against billions of dollars of subsidies for logging and for wood products. So I think that there's lots of things we can do, but the bottom line is that a lot of those things start to sort themselves out once we protect a lot more forests. But the answer is we really do need to reduce our wood consumption. We don't just cut it somewhere else. We really do need to reduce our wood consumption and protect a lot more forests.
Yeah, the only thing I would add to what Chad just really hit the nail on the head is that it is really sad to me to know that a lot of, or most of, the deforestation and degradation occurring in the Canadian boreal is for toilet paper. If that is not the biggest waste on the planet, I don't know what is. I mean, we take this incredibly biodiverse, carbon-dense forest and we flush it down the toilet. So we've got to find better ways of stewarding and using our natural resources, because it's clearly not sustainable.
Great. Awesome. Thank you, guys. This is a more general big picture question, but can you guys kind of go into what the significance is for documenting high severity fire? Why that's
I want to make sure I understand the question. The significance, like why it's important to document historical high severity fire?
I believe so, yes. The question is written as, what is the significance?
Yeah. No, that's a really good question. It's a subtle question, but I think an important one. The reason it's important is that we need to know about the natural fire regimes and disturbance regimes in these forests so that we understand the heterogeneity that occurred before fire suppression and logging. And so we understand the different things that different species need. So if we didn't understand that high severity fire patches were a natural component of mixed conifer forests, for example, then we would mistakenly believe, which land managers did for decades, that blackback woodpeckers, for example, don't need high severity fire, because we all know high severity fire is unnatural in these forests. And therefore, if a high severity fire patch occurs, well, why not just clear cut it, get some lumber value out of it? That was the attitude for years and years and years and years. Unfortunately, it's still the attitude among a lot of land managers in the U.S. Forest Service. But things are starting to change because science has told us that there is abundant evidence that these forests were mixed severity fire regimes historically, and there were small and large high severity fire patches. And that explains why the blackback woodpecker keeps being found in those areas. And that's where you find them nesting and foraging overwhelmingly. Yeah, you can find them in unburned forests occasionally nesting, and I've found them there nesting and reproducing, but it typically is in areas that have a huge density of dead trees from drought and from drought cycles, or from some other non-fire related cause. And so you still have those patches of snag forest there. And so we use the science to understand about the past so we can understand how to move forward in the future, and we can value appropriately from an ecological standpoint the heterogeneity that processes like mixed severity fire and drought cycles, the heterogeneity that they create.
Yeah, the quick addition of what Dr. Hanson just said is to let you all know that the two of us are working on a second edition of Nature's Phoenix. That was, I think, the seminal work in terms of bringing the science together with, I think, 27 scientists from around the world on the importance of mixed severity, including high severity from an ecosystem standpoint. I will say this, high severity needs a lot more love. Go out there and hug a big dead tree, because those areas are as biodiverse as old growth. They may seem at first as an eyesore or as a loss. You may go into them feeling sad that what was a old growth forest is now a big burn patch. but it's the connection between life and death in a forest, and it's all part of the same process. And so it's underappreciated, it's often logged, and it's incredibly biodiverse and carbon rich, and we need to do more to send us some love out to those forests.
No, I appreciate that point and the way my colleagues said it, and I'll just add to that. Look, if you're excited about wildlife, if you're a birder, go out to the snag forest, a mature forest that burned at high severity. If it wasn't logged and wasn't planted, go out there 5-6 years post fire. In the spring, in late May, early June, go out there in the morning and you'll just see a show. Nature will put on a show for you like nothing you've ever seen before. You'll tick off, a few more birds on your lifetime list. Typically, and I've gone out with people many, many times, lifelong birders, and they're just blown away at how many species they're adding in a single morning. So, it really is a remarkable habitat, and it needs to be appreciated in co-equal fashion with mature and old forest.
Yeah, and then my selfish takeaway from that is, as an East Coaster, I've had the beautiful opportunity working with Muir Project to be able to go and explore these areas, and it's unlike anything you've ever seen. So if you've never had the chance to experience it, go out and give them some love. That's my other.
By the way, just real quickly on that, in terms of the East Coast, there was a really interesting study. Researchers have not really been looking at this issue in the eastern forests, and they finally started to look at it. And there was a study that just came out from a wildfire, mixed severity fire that burned several years ago in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. And guess what? They found the same thing we're finding in the West, that the high severity fire patches are incredibly biodiverse. They actually had the highest levels of avian diversity in those forests, and a lot of species that were strongly preferentially selecting the high severity fire patches. So that's not to say that you don't have species that are selecting low severity. You do. You need the mix. You want the low, you want the moderate, and you want the high. But the point is, you don't demonize or disregard or exploit the high severity. That's some of the best stuff out there in the East and the West.
Absolutely. And we just got a great question from that little discussion about providing some places to go visit. So that will be included in our follow-up materials. We'll have lots to show and share because we want people to be out here in these ecosystems. They're fantastic. So that will definitely be in our follow-ups. I want to just note that we're probably only have time for 1 or 2 more questions. So I'm going to, looking at the list that I have, I'm going to try to pick 2 that we can kind of wrap this up in a cohesive way. So the one I'm going to start with is, what are some potential future research directions or areas of investigation that could build upon the findings of your study? Are there any specific aspects or unanswered questions that you believe require further exploration?
Maybe we both have some thoughts on that, and I'll be brief. I know time is short here, but I'll just say that one thing we haven't touched on as much here, but I think it's a really important area for more research, is the subject of natural regeneration of the forest after fires, especially after high severity fire. And there's a lot of misinformation out there about that. And it's that misinformation is really pushing these same misguided policies. And I'll just say that this is something I've done some research on, and what we found that there's a whole series of key methodological flaws in the studies that the Forest Service has been putting out for years, where they've been claiming that 40 or so percent of the area in the high severity fire patches have been deforested and type converted and have no regeneration. We found that was a function of too small field plot size. If your field plots are really tiny, you're going to end up with a lot of zeros, no trees in your plots, no seedlings, no saplings. But it's just because your field plots are so small. Or in many cases of poor methodology, where the field plots were stuck on top of a rock outcropping or in a wet meadow, or in some cases in an old logging landing, a logging road, in one case in the middle of a river. Obviously, you're not going to find post-fire conifer seedlings in the middle of a river. And so, there's some key methodological problems that come up. When we corrected for those, we found that in almost every single plot, there was significant conifer regeneration, even in the areas where they claimed there was none, oftentimes 200-300 per acre in the areas where they claimed there was zero. So I think this is a really important thing, because a lot of people accept everything else we're saying, but say, yeah, but we can't allow high severity fire because it's type converting the forest to a moonscape, a deforested wasteland. That's just absolutely not true. And so that's, I think, a really important area for future research.
Yeah, I would add to that. We used to have this saying in graduate school: studies show that more studies are needed. It's a bit circular, but that's sometimes true. And in this case, I think it's really important for us to track wildfire behavior in relation to land use patterns. And we often hear this with not just the agencies, but groups like the Nature Conservancy. Well, look at the fire laid down in places that were thinned. And then we do a Google Earth overlay, or we use the fire severity data when it comes out a year later, and we overlay that with areas that were logged or burned or thinned, and we see something completely different. And so I think we're going to need to do more of those studies because of the misinformation that's out there. An example being the Bootleg fire. Got a lot of press about how wonderful the fire laid down in an area thinned by the Nature Conservancy, but when we actually checked that, we didn't see it. And often what is slowing down these fires is the change in the wind direction. The humidity levels go up at night, and they could get a better hold on the fire when the humidity levels go up. There are all these other factors that aren't considered when statements like that are made to the press, and then decision makers run with it. So I think replicating more of those studies is absolutely essential. We don't know nearly enough about what's happening in the Southwest with these claims relative to the Northwest. So, having more of those replicates in different regions that are dealing with the same kind of misinformation load, and actually getting in there and seeing what's happening and then being able to publish and communicate about it, I think is going to help everybody.
Yeah, I think that's a really important point. I'll just kind of expand a little bit on that Dr. DellaSala's point about the kind of cherry picking of locations. In any large fire, everything is going to burn. You're going to have a mix of severities in every single type of forest or every condition you might imagine. In the thinned areas, you're going to have some low, you're going to have some moderate, you're going to have some high. In the unthinned forest, same thing. And so you can find a thin forest that burned at low severity. And if you search hard enough, you'll find one where there's an unthinned forest somewhere in line of sight that happened to burn at high severity. And we see this, every single year in fire season, and the Forest Service and the logging industry and also the Nature Conservancy will take reporters and policymakers out to that one location, that little spot, again and again and again and again. Say, look, thinning works. And they ignore the fact that over the ridge, there's a thinned area that burned at high severity right next to an unthinned forest that burned at low severity. And then the drainage down the slope, more thin forests that burned at high severity and unthinned that burned at low severity. And so they ignore all the counterexamples and only cherry pick that one thing that supports their narrative. But, we're scientists, and we follow data, and we use unbiased sampling, and we use all the data so we can actually discover what the truth is. And when we do that, which is how we do our work, we find that it does not support that narrative. In fact, it typically contradicts it rather strongly.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And so our last question, we'll try to end on a positive note here, is kind of circling back to stuff that we alluded to at the beginning, is and this is a particularly interesting question because they call out a specific group, but it's, how do we get this message out to the climate change folks as well? They tend to talk about wildfires and bolster the fear of wildfires, but they don't discuss logging and how that contributes to more carbon and less fire and the loss of fires. And how that contributes to more carbon, less than wildfires. So an overarching, and try to find a good way to phrase this to wrap up our webinar today, is just, how do we get this message out here, and how do we move forward, and how do we bring more people into this narrative?
You want to take that, Dr. DellaSala, or shall I? I think you're muted.
You're still muted.
Yeah, sorry. Yeah, I'll take it first because this is an area I work on a lot with the climate change folks in particular, and the climate change scientific community as well. And I think, we should be allies working together and not at odds. I mean, we have a lot of common interests. We both care about the future of the planet and what's going to happen not only to our forests, but to society writ large with the escalating climate impacts. I mean, the latest study now shows that the world is dangerously close to crossing the 1.5 degrees centigrade safety net, which could occur by 2027. That's 4 years from now. And then everything gets really a lot more severe. So working together is much more preferred than working at odds. And I think it's just a lack of understanding. I know some of these folks that are really strong on climate change, yet they don't understand the forest connection. They're worried about fires. They think logging is going to help. And so I just think we need to be working more cross-disciplinary. A lot of these groups are very much tied into social justice issues. There's another area that we need to be working more together with the communities on climate change, bringing in the forest component as a plus, not a minus. I mean, the best terrestrial carbon sink on the planet are forests, are old forests, are forests that are burned, and they need to be enlisted as part of the solution, not the problem.
Yeah, I agree with all that. And I'll just add that in my experience, a lot of folks who are focused on, who are in organizations, NGOs, working to fight the climate crisis and fighting the good fight, a lot of folks still do not quite understand that the science has moved far beyond where we were in the 1990s. What the science is telling us now, and there's a broad consensus globally among climate scientists and ecologists on this, is that we cannot overcome the climate crisis only by getting away from and moving away from fossil fuel consumption and all the carbon emissions associated with that. That is necessary, but it's not sufficient. We also have to protect a lot more habitat of all types: forests, wetlands, grasslands, deserts, but especially forests, because there's such a massive carbon sink. We have to do that so we can draw down that dangerous excess CO2 in our atmosphere. They are co-equally important. And if we're only doing one and not the other, we fail. And so this is the message that I have for everybody, is that we need solidarity in our movement among scientists, among NGOs. We need to come together. Social justice, climate change, biodiversity groups. We need to come together and work together and understand that there are so many intersections and so much common cause that we have. And that we have to come together to succeed. And then when we come together, we know that we are far, far more powerful, and the whole is greater than the sum of the parts.
Awesome. Thank you so much to both of you, Dr. Hanson and Dr. DellaSala. It was amazing to have you on today. Thank you to everybody who stayed for the whole of the presentation. We really appreciate you. And just to sum up again, any questions that we did not answer that were submitted will be have written responses in our follow-up. You will also have access to the 2 studies that Dr. DellaSala alluded to in his preamble. The letter that he was referring to as well about the scientists. And then there was a couple other resources that we mentioned, like the talking points and the write-up of the study to disseminate as well. So those will all be coming to you within the next 2 weeks. Please look out for that. And then expect to see this recording up on our YouTube page within a week or so as well. The only other caveat that I will mention is that we will be having another one of these very soon on really important issues, primarily focusing around sequoias and the different legislation that's coming out surrounding that. So please keep an eye out for that as well. We will have those announcements circulating shortly. So thank you, everybody who participated, and we will see you all next time.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Dr. DellaSala. Thanks, MC.
Yeah, thanks, Dr.
Great job.
Bye, guys.